The hill should have stopped him. Any sane man, any rational general, would have looked at Munda on the morning of March 17th, 45 BC, and turned around. Pompeian legions ranked along the ridge, the ground rising steeply, slick with winter rain. No cover, no angle, just open slope and 70,000 men waiting at the top. Caesar ordered the advance anyway. For 3 hours, his veterans climbed into it. Javelins came downhill in waves. Men died without ever reaching an enemy they could hit back at. And slowly, horribly, the finest army Rome had ever produced began to stall. That's when Caesar did something no Roman general was supposed to do. He grabbed a shield from the soldier nearest to him. Not his own armor, just whatever was closest. Pushed through his own retreating lines and walked to the front. 55 years old, the conqueror of Gaul, the man who crossed the Rubicon. Standing in the mud of a Spanish hillside, screaming at his own men that he would die here alone if they didn't follow. He said it himself afterward. He had fought 100 battles for victory. At Munda, for the first and only time, he fought for his life. This is not a story about a great man winning. This is a story about what it costs to survive when winning is no longer enough. Welcome to the Clash of Ancients. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, new battle every week. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Here is what most people get wrong about Munda. They treat it as a footnote, the last engagement of Caesar's civil war, a cleanup operation, an inevitable victory that tidied up loose ends left by grander battles. Pharsalus, Thapsus, those were the real battles the history books imply. Munda was just the afterword. That reading is wrong. Munda was the closest Julius Caesar ever came to losing everything. It was the battle that forced him to confess a terror he had never admitted before. And here is the part that nobody talks about. Caesar didn't win this battle because of his genius. He won because his enemy made one mistake, one movement, at exactly the wrong moment. We'll get to that moment. But first, you need to understand the man on the other side of that hill. Gnaeus Pompeius the Younger was not fighting for Rome. He was not fighting for the Republic, or for ideology, or for power. He was fighting because his father had been murdered on an Egyptian beach, his head delivered to Caesar in a sack, and nobody had paid for it. That his father, Pompey the Great, had been the dominant military figure of Rome for a generation, commander of the East, conqueror of the Mediterranean, 3-time consul. And Caesar had broken him at Pharsalus in 48 BC, and Pompey had fled, and Egypt had finished the job. Gnaeus had watched all of it. He had fought with the surviving Pompeian forces in Africa, survived their collapse at Thapsus in 46 BC, and fled to Hispania Ulteria, southern Spain, where his father had once governed and was still, even in death, beloved. And there, in the mountains and plains of what is now Andalusia, he had done something nobody expected. He rebuilt 13 legions, roughly 70,000 men, not the polished elite of Gaul, but experienced, motivated, and fighting on home ground, and commanding his cavalry, Titus Labienus, Caesar's own former chief legate, the man who had designed half of Caesar's greatest victories in Gaul, now riding for the other side. Caesar arrived in Spain in late 46 BC with 8 legions, approximately 40,000 men. He had spent months maneuvering across the south, trying to force a decisive engagement. Gnaeus kept refusing. He had the numbers. He had the terrain. He had no reason to fight on Caesar's terms. Until March 17th, 45 BC. Until Munda. The ground alone should have ended this before it began. The Pompeian position ran along a ridge roughly 2 kilometers wide, elevated, deep, and offering clear fields of fire across the entire slope below. In front of that ridge, the ground descended gradually toward a shallow stream, not a cliff, not impassable, but enough of a slope that attacking uphill would cost speed, cost formation, and cost lives before a single sword made contact. Caesar's officers looked at it and advised caution. Caesar looked at it and understood something harder. He had no choice. This is the trap Gnaeus Pompeius had built, perhaps without fully realizing how elegant it was. He didn't need to beat Caesar. He only needed to not lose. Every week of inconclusive maneuvering was a Pompeian victory. Caesar's supply lines were stretched thin. His veterans were tired. The Spanish countryside, loyal to the Pompeian name, was bleeding Caesarian foragers in small skirmishes that added up quietly. Time was the weapon, and time was on Gnaeus's side. So Caesar ordered the advance at approximately 9 in the morning. 8 legions crossed the stream and began to climb. The 10th legion on the right, the 3rd and 5th anchoring the left. Shields locked. I'm moving at the controlled pace that Roman training had drilled into muscle memory. The Pompeians held. 3 hours. That is not a short engagement. That is 3 hours of climbing uphill into continuous javelin fire, shields overhead, men going down around you, the formation shuffling and closing and pushing forward, and gaining almost nothing. The veterans who had never broken, not at the Samba, not at Gergovia, not at Pharsalus, were not breaking now. But they were not advancing either. They were dying in place. And here is what that means in numbers. 8 legions, roughly 40,000 men, locked on an exposed slope against 70,000 defenders on prepared ground. The mathematics of that equation do not favor the men climbing. Every minute that passed, the odds shifted further against Caesar. By mid-morning, the attack had stalled completely. Caesar could see it from his command position. The finest army Rome had built, his army, the men he had marched from the Rhine to the Rubicon, was losing. Slowly, measurably, irreversibly. 40,000 men, 8 veteran legions, and the hill was winning. Then, on the Pompeian right wing, something moved. The night of March 16th was cold in the way Spanish winter nights are cold. Dry and sharp, the air so clear that the fires in the enemy camp looked close enough to touch. In the Pompeian camp on the ridge, the mood was close to confident. Gnaeus Pompeius had been chased across Hispania for months, denied a decisive engagement, forced to watch Caesar maneuver with the patience of a man who had done this before. But here, on this ground, with these numbers, something had shifted. His officers ate well. Then his legions, many recruited locally, were fighting for a name that still meant something in this province. And Labienus moved through the camp with the quiet confidence of a man who had assessed the morning's battle and found the odds acceptable. One of the Pompeian officers reportedly said it plainly. Caesar would either attack uphill or retreat. Either outcome served them. In the Caesarian camp below, it was quieter, not fearful. Caesar's veterans were not capable of simple fear, but waited. These were men who had been marching and fighting in Spain since autumn. They looked at the ridge above them the way experienced men look at problems with no good solutions, steadily, without flinching, but without illusion. The 10th Legion's centurions walked the lines in the dark and said very little. What was there to say? And they had climbed worse walls. They had faced longer odds. They had always had Caesar. Caesar himself barely slept. He moved through the camp, not making speeches, not performing morale, just looking, thinking. He knew what the morning required. And somewhere in the private mathematics of his mind, he may have already calculated that if the battle went wrong, there was only one thing left to try. His own body, his own presence, his own life, placed at the front of the line. One man, 55 years old, a borrowed shield waiting for morning. Wait. The 30,000 men who will die tomorrow. History won't remember their names. No chronicle will record who Lucius was, or the young Spanish recruit who picked up a sword for the first time. They were given a number, 30,000. But tonight, on this cold March 16th, they are alive. And some are thinking about home. Some are afraid. Some aren't thinking at all, just sitting by a fire, eyes low, waiting for morning. Does it matter which camp they're sleeping in? Caesar saw the movement. Labienus was shifting the Pompeian cavalry, pulling it from the right wing, swinging it laterally along the ridge. The intention was sound: reinforce the struggling left flank, press the advantage where Caesar's legions were visibly flagging, fold the line inward, and end it. It was a reasonable instinct. It was the last mistake Gnaeus Pompeius ever made. Here is the problem with lateral movement in the middle of an engaged battle. Your own men see it, and they don't know it's a repositioning. They see their cavalry moving away from them, and in the heat and noise and confusion of 3 hours of combat, there is only one thing that looks like retreat. The Pompeian right wing, which had held for 3 hours against everything Caesar's army could throw at it, began to pull back. Not because they were beaten, because they thought they already were. Caesar saw it the instant it began, and he did not hesitate. The order went through the Caesarian army like a pulse: advance. All of them, now. Every legion, every cohort, every exhausted man on that slope, forward. But an order alone wouldn't be enough. His men had been climbing for 3 hours. They were spent. The line needed something it couldn't generate from inside itself. Caesar took the shield. He pushed through the ranks, through men who tried to stop him, around officers who reached for his arm, and walked to the front of the line. Plutarch records that he screamed at his veterans that he would die here alone if they did not come, that it would be the shame of his life, the shame of their lives, if a man his age could reach the enemy when they could not. It was not a noble speech. It was not the Caesar of the history books, composed, brilliant, magnanimous. This was raw, personal, almost desperate. The words of a man who had run out of options and was spending himself as the last one. The 10th Legion came. They came up that slope at a pace that should have been physically impossible for men who had fought for 3 hours in heavy armor. But the sight of their general, visible, recognizable, 55 years old and moving toward the enemy line, did something to the mathematics of courage that cannot be fully calculated. These men had followed Caesar from Gaul to the Rubicon, to Egypt, to Africa, to Spain. They were not going to watch him die on a hillside. The Pompeian right collapsed first. Labienus's lateral movement had physically thinned the cohorts on that sector of the ridge. When Caesar's surge hit that weakened point, it went through. And once one section broke, the collapse ran along the entire Pompeian line, not all at once, but in cascading sections, each failure triggering the next, like ice cracking under a man who kept walking anyway. Labienus rode to stop it, because that is what soldiers of his caliber do. They don't stop trying. He moved to rally the cavalry, to plug the gap, to buy time for the infantry to reform. It didn't work. Titus Labienus, the man who had held the Rhine, outflanked the Belgae. He served Caesar faithfully for 7 years in Gaul and opposed him for 4 years of civil war, was killed on the field at Munda, cut down by soldiers who had learned the trade of war from officers he had trained. Caesar's greatest former officer, killed by Caesar's own methods on Caesar's own ground. The route that followed was not a pursuit, it was a massacre. Pompeian soldiers fled in every direction, toward Munda, toward the countryside, toward anywhere that wasn't the collapsing line. Caesar's cavalry ran them down without mercy. His infantry pursued without stopping. 30,000 dead in a single afternoon. And here is the part that complicates the story. Caesar ordered the heads of Labienus and other Pompeian commanders displayed on spikes outside Munda. This was not the Caesar of Clementia, the merciful conqueror who had pardoned Brutus, released his prisoners at Pharsalus, spared the men who had fought against him. That Caesar had been burned off somewhere on that slope, between the moment he grabbed a stranger's shield and the moment his veterans crested the ridge. What came down from that hill was harder, and it would never fully soften again. Gnaeus Pompeius escaped wounded. He was captured and executed within weeks. Sextus Pompeius, the younger brother, also escaped. He would fight on for years, becoming a persistent problem in the next generation of civil war. But that is a different story, for a different video. Munda was over. Caesar had won. Caesar won, and it killed him. Not immediately, not on the field, but the chain that Munda forged, link by link, led directly to the Ides of March. He returned to Rome in late 45 BC as the absolute master of the Roman world. No armed force remained capable of challenging him. The Senate voted him honors without precedent, dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. His portrait appeared on Roman coins while he was still alive, the first living Roman ever given that distinction. The month Quintilis was renamed Julius, July, in his honor. He planned a massive campaign against Parthia. He reformed the calendar, the one we still use today, with minor modifications. He redesigned the forum. He was, by every visible measure, untouchable. And that was precisely the problem. A man who had defeated every armed opponent, who had been named dictator for life, who appeared on the coinage, and who accepted honors edging toward the divine. This was no longer a Roman general or even a Roman politician. In the minds of Brutus, Cassius, and 60 other men meeting in secret through the winter of 45 to 44 BC, this was a king. And Rome, in its bones, in its 600-year identity, did not have kings. They killed him on March 15th, 44 BC, 364 days after Munda. The war that Munda ended resumed almost immediately. Antony against the Senate, Octavian against Antony. 17 more years of civil war, proscription and mass death, killing far more than the 30,000 who fell on that Spanish hillside. The republic Caesar had conquered did not survive his death. The dictatorship Caesar had built did not survive his death either. What survived was the idea, refined over the following decades by his heir Octavian into the Principate, the system that would govern Rome for the next 4 centuries. The Rome that conquered Britain, that built Hadrian's Wall, that produced Marcus Aurelius, that gave the world Roman law. All of it built on the foundation of what Caesar won at Munda and what he became, coming down from that hill. The cold open asked, what does it cost a man to survive when winning is no longer enough? Here is the answer, though it isn't a clean one. It cost Caesar his mercy. The particular quality of magnanimity that had made him something more than just another warlord, the clementia that had defined his civil war, that burned away on the slope at Munda. The man who returned to Rome was harder, more absolute, less willing to tolerate the ambiguity that the Republic required. The conspiracy against him formed in the shadow of what he had become after Munda, not before it. He survived the hill. He did not entirely survive surviving it. Munda is not remembered the way Pharsalus is remembered. It sits at the end of Caesar's story, like a final sentence most readers rush past to get to the ending they already know. But the ending is in Munda, the absolute victory, the heads on the stakes, the 11 months, the 364 days. When you imagine yourself at the base of that hill, exhausted, watching your general grab a shield and push to the front, do you follow him? And when you answer that, are you answering honestly, or only the way you hope you would? If this video meant something to you, unsubscribe to the Clash of Ancients. We do this every week. Share it with someone who thinks they already know Caesar's story. And drop a comment below. Was Munda Caesar's greatest moment, or the first step toward his assassination? I want to know what you think. This has been the Clash of Ancients. Some fields remember what was done on them longer than the men who did it. And I will see you in the next one.